It was a typical Tuesday evening when Maria walked through the doors of Riverside Community College. The hallways smelled like old books and cleaning supplies, and her footsteps echoed softly on the worn linoleum floors. She clutched her small purse tightly and kept her eyes down as she searched for room 204. At 34, she felt completely out of place among the younger students rushing past her with their backpacks and coffee cups. Maria had spent the last 15 years behind a desk, crunching numbers and balancing spreadsheets at a small accounting firm downtown. Her days were predictable and quiet, just the way she liked them. She wore simple clothes, spoke softly, and never drew attention to herself. Her co-workers knew her as the reliable one who always finished her work on time and never caused any drama. But tonight was different. Tonight, Maria was doing something she hadn't done in years. She was stepping back into the world of music. The piano classroom was smaller than she had expected. About 20 students were scattered around the room, chatting nervously or flipping through music books. Maria chose a seat in the very back corner, hoping to blend into the shadows. She pulled out a small notebook and a pen, keeping her hands busy so she wouldn't have to make eye contact with anyone. Professor Rodriguez walked in carrying a stack of papers and a steaming cup of coffee. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, the type of teacher who genuinely cared about his students. He set his things down on the piano and smiled at the group. "Welcome everyone to Music Fundamentals. I know some of you are here because you need the credit, and others because you've always wanted to learn piano. Either way, we're going to have a great semester together." Maria watched as the other students introduced themselves. There was Jake, a college freshman who admitted he couldn't even read music. Lisa, a retired nurse who wanted to fulfill a childhood dream. Tom, a construction worker whose daughter had inspired him to try something new. Each person shared a little about their background and their hopes for the class. When Professor Rodriguez's eyes landed on Maria, she felt her stomach twist into knots. "And you in the back? Tell us about yourself." Maria's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm Maria. I work in accounting. I used to play piano a little bit when I was younger, but it's been a really long time. I just want to see if I can remember anything." She left out so much in those few sentences. She didn't mention the years of intensive training that started when she was just 5 years old. She didn't talk about the countless hours spent practicing scales until her fingers bled. She didn't tell them about the competitions she had won across Europe as a teenager, or the standing ovations she had received in concert halls that most people only dream of seeing. Most importantly, she didn't mention that night at Carnegie Hall when she was 19, the night that changed everything, the night when her mind went completely blank in the middle of a performance, leaving her frozen on stage in front of 2,000 people, the night that ended her career and sent her running from music forever. As the weeks passed, Maria settled into a comfortable routine of being invisible. She sat in the same back corner seat every Tuesday and Thursday evening. She wore the same style of clothes, plain sweaters and dark pants that helped her blend into the background. When Professor Rodriguez asked for volunteers to demonstrate techniques, Maria always kept her eyes down and her hands folded. During practice sessions, Maria was careful to play like someone who was genuinely struggling to remember basic skills. She would hesitate before placing her fingers on the keys, as if she was trying to remember where middle C was located. She deliberately played with stiff fingers and poor posture, making beginner mistakes that she had stopped making by age 7. Her classmates began to form opinions about her. Some felt sorry for the quiet woman who seemed to be trying so hard but couldn't quite get it right. Others grew slightly impatient when Maria would stumble through simple exercises that they were mastering quickly. A few of the younger students would exchange glances when she played, not unkindly, but with the kind of look that said, "At least I'm not as bad as her." Maria could feel their judgment, and strangely, it didn't bother her. In fact, it felt safer this way. Being seen as the struggling student meant that no one expected anything from her. No one would ask her to perform solos or draw attention to her abilities. She could exist in this comfortable space of low expectations and complete anonymity. But hiding her true abilities was harder than she had anticipated. Every time she sat at the piano, Her muscle memory wanted to take over. Her fingers knew where to go without her conscious mind directing them. When Professor Rodriguez would demonstrate a technique, Maria would find herself automatically correcting her posture or adjusting her hand position in ways that showed years of professional training. She had to constantly remind herself to play worse than she actually could. It was exhausting, this constant performance of being someone she wasn't. Sometimes, late at night when she practiced at home on her old piano, the one piece of her musical past she couldn't bring herself to sell, she would let her fingers remember what they used to know. The music would pour out of her like water, from a broken dam, beautiful and powerful and completely natural. But then the memories would come flooding back, the bright stage lights that made her squint, the sea of expectant faces in the audience, the moment when her mind went blank and the music stopped, leaving her sitting in terrible silence while 2,000 people waited for her to continue, the shame that followed her off that stage and never quite left. Those memories were enough to make her close the piano lid and walk away, sometimes for days at a time. Professor Rodriguez began to notice that Maria seemed to know more than she was letting on. Sometimes he would catch her starting to play something correctly before stopping herself and making a mistake. Once he saw her automatically adjust another student's hand position during a group exercise, then quickly pull her hand back as if she had done something wrong. "Maria," he said after class one evening, "do you have a few minutes to chat?" Maria's heart started racing, but she nodded and waited while the other students filed out of the room. "I've been teaching for 20 years, Professor Rodriguez said gently, "and I've learned to recognize when someone has more experience than they're showing. You don't have to tell me your whole story, but I want you to know that this is a safe space. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're looking for, I'm here to help." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I appreciate that, Professor, I really do. But I'm exactly where I need to be right now. I just want to take things slow and see what happens." He nodded, understanding that some stories weren't ready to be told. "Well, you know where to find me if that changes." As Maria walked to her car that night, she thought about how much her life had changed since that terrible night 15 years ago. She had built a quiet, predictable existence where music was just a memory that she kept carefully locked away. But sitting in that classroom twice a week, surrounded by people who were brave enough to try something new, was stirring something inside her that she thought was gone forever. She didn't know it yet, but that stirring was about to become impossible to ignore. 3 weeks had passed since that conversation with Professor Rodriguez, and Maria had settled even deeper into her role as the class's struggling student. She arrived each Tuesday and Thursday evening with the same quiet determination, took her usual seat in the back corner, and continued her careful performance of being someone who was barely keeping up. The other students had grown comfortable around her now. Jake, the college freshman, would sometimes offer her helpful tips that made her want to smile. "Try keeping your wrists a little higher, Maria," he'd whisper during practice time, genuinely trying to help. Lisa, the retired nurse, had taken Maria under her wing like a protective older sister, always making sure she felt included in group discussions. Maria found herself growing fond of these people, which made her deception feel even more complicated. They were good people with pure intentions, working hard to learn something new. Meanwhile, she was sitting among them pretending to struggle with pieces she could play in her sleep. During one particularly challenging lesson, Professor Rodriguez was teaching them about proper finger technique for scales. He demonstrated on the piano, his fingers moving smoothly up and down the keys, while he explained the importance of curved fingers and relaxed wrists. "Now, I want everyone to try this," he said, stepping back from the piano. "We'll go around the room and each person can have a turn at the keyboard." One by one, students took their turns. Some did well, others struggled with the coordination. When it was Maria's turn, she walked slowly to the piano bench, very aware that everyone was watching. She positioned her hands on the keys and began to play the scale, deliberately making her movements stiff and awkward. But halfway through, something happened that she hadn't expected. Her muscle memory kicked in for just a split second, and her fingers naturally curved into the perfect position. She played 3 notes with flawless technique before catching herself and returning to her clumsy performance. It was such a brief moment that most students didn't notice. But Professor Rodriguez did. His eyebrows raised slightly, and Maria saw him make a small note on his paper. Her heart pounded as she returned to her seat, hoping she hadn't given herself away. As the semester progressed, these little slips became more frequent. During a lesson on reading sheet music, Maria accidentally sight-read a complex passage that should have taken her several attempts to figure out. While practicing a simple melody, she instinctively added harmonies that turned the basic tune into something beautiful and sophisticated. Each time it happened, she would quickly cover her mistake by playing something wrong or stopping altogether. But she could feel Professor Rodriguez watching her more closely, and she noticed some of her classmates starting to look puzzled by her inconsistent abilities. The tension came to a head during the 8th week of class. Professor Rodriguez had been growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a lack of effort from several students. The younger students were progressing quickly, but a few of the adult learners seemed to be stuck at a beginner level despite weeks of instruction. That Thursday evening, he walked into class looking more serious than usual. He set his coffee down with a sharp clink and turned to face the group with his arms crossed. "I've been thinking about our midterm evaluations," he began, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone sit up straighter. "Some of you are progressing, exactly as I expected. Others," he paused, his eyes scanning the room, "are not putting in the effort that this class requires." Maria felt her stomach drop. She had a terrible feeling about where this conversation was heading. For your midterm, each of you will perform a solo piece in front of the class. This will count for 30% of your final grade. He walked over to his desk and picked up a stack of sheet music. "I've selected pieces that match each student's current ability level." He began calling out names and handing out assignments. Jake received a simple folk melody. Lisa got a beginner's version of Amazing Grace. Tom was assigned a basic blues progression that suited his interests. As Professor Rodriguez worked his way through the class, Maria's anxiety grew with each passing moment. She watched him pause as he reached her name on his list, and she saw something that looked almost like annoyance flash across his face. "Maria," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet classroom. All eyes turned to her, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I've been watching your progress this semester, and I have to be honest. I'm not seeing the improvement I expected." The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This felt more personal than the other assignments, and everyone could sense the tension in the room. "You seem to be having difficulty with even the most basic concepts," Professor Rodriguez continued. "So I've decided that you need to be challenged. Sometimes when students aren't progressing, it's because they're not being pushed hard enough." Maria's hands started to tremble in her lap. She had a horrible feeling about what was coming next. Professor Rodriguez walked over to the piano and pulled out a piece of sheet music that looked far more complex than anything else he had distributed. The page was covered with notes that seemed to dance across the staff lines with markings and symbols that indicated advanced techniques. "You'll be performing Chopin's Etude in E minor, Opera 25, number 5, he announced, holding up the music so the class could see it. "It's a challenging piece, but I think the pressure might motivate you to finally take your practice seriously." Several students gasped audibly. Even those who couldn't read music well could see that this piece looked nothing like the simple melodies the others had received. Jake's mouth fell open and Lisa looked genuinely concerned for Maria. "Professor," Lisa spoke up hesitantly, "isn't that a bit advanced for someone who's still working on basic scales?" Professor Rodriguez's expression didn't soften. "Maria has had the same amount of instruction as everyone else. If she's been paying attention and practicing as she should be, this shouldn't be impossible. It will just require dedication." Maria stared at the sheet music in her hands, her vision blurring slightly as she took in the familiar notes. Chopin's Etude Op. 25, number 5. She had performed this piece dozens of times as a teenager. It was technically demanding, requiring precise fingerwork and sophisticated musical understanding. She remembered playing it for her teacher when she was 16, and how proud she had felt when she finally mastered its challenges. But that was a lifetime ago. when she was a different person entirely. "You have 2 weeks to prepare," Professor Rodriguez said, his tone final. "I suggest you use the practice rooms here at the college as much as possible. The midterm performances will be next Thursday evening, and attendance is mandatory for all students." As he moved on to explain the logistics of the performance evening, Maria sat frozen in her seat. Around her, she could hear whispered conversations between classmates. "That's not fair," someone muttered behind her. "She's going to be so embarrassed," another voice said softly. "Maybe she should talk to the dean about this." But Maria wasn't thinking about fairness or embarrassment. She was thinking about the piece of music in her hands and the impossible situation she had created for herself. If she played this piece the way she was capable of playing it, her entire carefully constructed facade would crumble in an instant. Everyone would know she had been lying to them for months. But if she tried to fake her way through it, maintaining her pretense of being a struggling beginner, she would almost certainly fail spectacularly. This wasn't a simple melody where she could hide her abilities behind deliberate mistakes. This was a piece that required genuine skill to even attempt. Class ended with the usual chatter and gathering of belongings, but Maria remained in her seat long after the others had left. She stared at the sheet music, reading through the familiar passages and remembering how her fingers used to dance across these exact notes. Professor Rodriguez was packing up his things when he noticed she was still there. "Maria," he said, his voice softer now that they were alone. "I know this seems overwhelming, but sometimes we need to be pushed out of our comfort zones to discover what we're really capable of." If only he knew, Maria thought to herself. If only he knew that her comfort zone was exactly the place she was being asked to return to, and that it terrified her more than any amount of struggle or failure ever could. She nodded quietly, gathered her things, and walked out into the evening, carrying with her a piece of music that represented everything she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Maria sat in her car in the college parking lot for 20 minutes after class ended, staring at the sheet music in her hands. The fluorescent lights from the building cast long shadows across the pages, making the notes look like tiny dancers frozen in time. Her hands were shaking so badly that the paper rustled with each tremor. She had 2 weeks. 14 days to figure out how to handle the impossible situation she had created for herself. The Chopinitude seemed to mock her from the pages. Every note a reminder of who she used to be and who she had spent 15 years pretending not to be. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs. Maria's mind kept racing between 2 equally terrifying options. She could perform the piece properly and watch her carefully constructed new life crumble as everyone realized she had been lying to them for months. Or she could try to fake her way through it and face almost certain humiliation when she inevitably failed. Her small apartment felt different when she walked through the door that night. The old upright piano that sat against the far wall seemed to be calling to her, demanding attention after weeks of being mostly ignored. She had bought the piano 3 years ago during a moment of weakness, telling herself it was just for occasional relaxation. But most nights she was too afraid to touch the keys. Maria made herself a cup of tea and sat on her couch, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at her sister's name. Carmen lived across the country now, married with 2 kids, and had no idea about Maria's musical past. To Carmen, her older sister was just a quiet accountant who lived alone and seemed content with her simple life. She almost called, desperate to talk to someone about the mess she had gotten herself into. But what would she say? How could she explain 15 years of deception, even to her own family? Instead, Maria found herself walking over to the piano. She lifted the lid slowly, as if it might bite her. The keys looked the same as always. White and black, perfectly aligned, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to bring them to life. She placed the sheet music on the piano stand and sat down on the bench. The familiar feel of the smooth wood beneath her legs brought back a flood of memories she usually kept locked away. Practice rooms that smelled like dust and rosin. Her childhood teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who used to rap her knuckles with a pencil when her posture wasn't perfect. The weight of expectations that grew heavier with each competition she won. Maria positioned her hands over the keys and began to play the opening measures of the Chopinitude. The notes flowed from her fingers like they had been waiting there, all along. Hidden just beneath the surface of her careful pretense, her muscle memory was flawless. Every phrase, every dynamic marking, every subtle shift in tempo exactly as she had learned it 20 years ago. For a moment she forgot about everything else. The music surrounded her like a warm embrace, reminding her of why she had fallen in love with piano in the first place. This was what she had missed during all those years of silence, not just the technical challenge or the admiration of audiences, but the pure joy of creating something beautiful with her own hands. But then the memories came crashing back as they always did. Carnegie Hall, 2009. The bright lights that made it impossible to see the audience clearly. The red velvet seats stretching back into darkness. The moment when her mind went completely blank in the middle of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, leaving her sitting at the piano bench with 2,000 people waiting for her to continue. The silence had stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. She had tried to start again, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The notes that had been so familiar just moments before suddenly seemed foreign and impossible. Finally, she had whispered an apology into her microphone and walked off stage, leaving behind not just her performance but her entire identity as a musician. Maria's hands froze on the keys and she pulled them back as if the piano had burned her. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool evening air. This was why she had stopped playing. This was why she had built a new life, where music was just background noise in coffee shops and elevators. She closed the piano lid and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Professor Rodriguez's disappointed face and hear the whispered conversations of her classmates who thought she was being treated unfairly. The next few days at work were torture. Maria sat at her desk, running numbers and processing invoices. But her mind was completely occupied with the approaching performance. Her co-workers noticed that she seemed distracted, but she brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about being tired. During her lunch breaks, she found herself researching Chopin etudes on her phone, reading about their technical requirements and watching videos of professional pianists performing them. Each video reminded her of her own capabilities while simultaneously reinforcing how impossible it would be to fake her way through such a demanding piece. By the weekend, Maria had developed a plan that felt like the least terrible of her bad options. She would practice the piece enough to play it somewhat competently, but she would deliberately add mistakes and hesitations to make it seem like she was struggling with material that was beyond her abilities. It wasn't perfect, but it might allow her to avoid both complete humiliation and total exposure. Saturday morning, she sat down at her piano with renewed determination. She started slowly, playing through the first page with careful attention to making believable mistakes. But her fingers had other ideas. Every time she tried to play a wrong note, her muscle memory corrected it automatically. When she attempted to slow down and make the tempo uneven, her internal rhythm kept pulling her back to the proper speed. It was like trying to write with her non-dominant hand or walk with an artificial limp, possible, but requiring constant, conscious effort that left her mentally exhausted after just a few minutes of practice. Maria realized she needed help, but she couldn't think of anyone to ask. She couldn't exactly call up a piano teacher and explain that she needed lessons on how to play badly. She couldn't ask her classmates for advice without revealing more than she was ready to share. As the days passed, her anxiety grew stronger. She would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, imagining different scenarios for how the performance might go. In some dreams, she played beautifully and was immediately exposed as a fraud. In others, she failed spectacularly and became a laughingstock. None of the scenarios ended well. Her classmates began reaching out to her, offering support and encouragement that made her feel even worse about her deception. Jake sent her a text with links to YouTube tutorials for beginners. Lisa offered to meet her at the college practice rooms to help her work through the difficult passages. Tom, the construction worker, even suggested that she talk to the dean about Professor Rodriguez's unfair assignment. Their kindness was overwhelming and heartbreaking at the same time. These people genuinely cared about her, but they were caring about someone who didn't actually exist. They were worried about a struggling beginner who was in over her head, not a former concert pianist who was terrified of being discovered. The Tuesday before her performance, Maria decided to visit the college practice rooms. She told herself it was just to get comfortable with playing on a different piano, but deep down she knew she was hoping for some kind of miracle. Maybe inspiration would strike, or she would figure out the perfect way to handle her impossible situation. The practice rooms were small, soundproof spaces with just a piano, a bench, and a music stand. Maria chose one at the end of the hall where she was least likely to be disturbed. She set up her music and began to play, letting herself get lost in the complexity and beauty of Chopin's composition. For 30 minutes, she played with the skill and passion that had once made her a rising star in the classical music world. Every note was perfect. Every phrase shaped with the understanding that comes from years of dedicated study. It felt incredible and terrifying at the same time. When she finally stopped playing, she realized she wasn't alone. Through the small window in the practice room door, she could see Professor Rodriguez standing in the hallway, his face pale with shock. Their eyes met for just a moment before he quickly walked away, leaving Maria to wonder exactly how much he had seen and what he planned to do with that information. She packed up her music with trembling hands, knowing that her time was running out. In just 2 days, she would have to face the music in more ways than one, and she still had no idea how she was going to survive what was coming next. Thursday evening arrived like an unwelcome storm. Maria sat in her car outside Riverside Community College for the 3rd time that week, but tonight felt completely different. Tonight was the night she had been dreading for 2 weeks, and her entire body seemed to be rebelling against what she was about to do. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely grip the steering wheel. She had barely eaten anything all day, and her stomach felt like it was full of angry butterflies. The sheet music for the Chopin etude sat on the passenger seat beside her, the pages now worn from countless hours of practice and worry. She had spent the last 2 days since Professor Rodriguez saw her in the practice room wondering if he would confront her before the performance. But he had acted completely normal during Tuesday's regular class, giving no indication that anything had changed. Maria couldn't decide if that made things better or worse. The college parking lot was more crowded than usual. She could see other students from her class walking toward the building, some carrying flowers from family members who had come to watch. Jake was walking with what looked like his parents and girlfriend, all of them laughing about something. Lisa had her husband with her, and he was carrying a small bouquet of roses. Maria realized that she hadn't told anyone about tonight's performance. There was no one in her life who even knew she was taking piano lessons, let alone performing, in front of a group. The loneliness hit her like a physical pain, reminding her of how isolated she had become since she stopped playing music professionally. She forced herself to get out of the car and walk toward the building. Each step felt like she was walking toward her own execution. The familiar hallways seemed longer tonight, and the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual. She could hear voices and laughter coming from the music room, and the sound made her want to turn around and run. When she reached the classroom, she saw that it had been transformed for the evening. The chairs were arranged in rows facing the piano, like a mini concert hall. There were about 30 people in attendance, the students from her class plus their family members and friends. Someone had even brought cookies and punch, making the whole thing feel more like a celebration than the nightmare Maria was experiencing. Professor Rodriguez was standing near the piano, greeting people and making small talk. When he saw Maria enter the room, their eyes met for just a moment. She tried to read his expression, looking for any sign that he planned to expose her secret, but his face gave nothing away. "Maria," Lisa called out, waving her over to where she was sitting with her husband. "Come sit with us, I saved you a seat." Maria managed a weak smile and made her way over to them. Lisa's husband, David, was a kind man who worked as a mechanic and had heard all about the piano class from his wife. "Lisa tells me you're playing a really challenging piece tonight," David said warmly. "I don't know much about music, but she says it's something pretty advanced. That's exciting." If only he knew how advanced, Maria thought to herself. She nodded and tried to look nervous in the way that a struggling student should be nervous, rather than terrified in the way that someone whose entire life was about to change should be terrified. Professor Rodriguez called for everyone's attention and explained how the evening would work. Each student would perform their assigned piece, and then there would be time for applause and maybe a few words about their progress. He had arranged the performances from simplest to most complex, which meant Maria would be going last. One by one, her classmates took their turns at the piano. Jake played his folk melody with only a few minor mistakes, and his family cheered loudly when he finished. Tom performed his blues progression with more confidence than Maria had expected, adding his own little flourishes that made everyone smile. Lisa's rendition of Amazing Grace was simple but heartfelt, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished. Each performance was met with warm applause and encouraging words from Professor Rodriguez. He praised their progress and highlighted specific improvements he had noticed throughout the semester. The atmosphere was supportive and celebratory, exactly the kind of environment that should have made Maria feel comfortable and welcomed. Instead, she felt like she was watching everything from outside her own body. The room seemed to be getting smaller with each passing minute, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool evening air. Her hands had moved beyond shaking and were now completely numb, which terrified her even more than the trembling had. As the performances continued, Maria found herself thinking about all the concerts she had given in her younger years. Prestigious venues across Europe, audiences of thousands, reviews in major newspapers that praised her technical skill and musical maturity. She had been someone then, someone important, someone with a future full of possibilities. Now she was about to either destroy the quiet life she had built for herself or humiliate herself in front of the only group of people who had welcomed her in years. There was no good way out of the corner she had painted herself into. And now, Professor Rodriguez announced, our final performance of the evening. Maria will be playing Chopin's Etude in E minor, Opera 25, number 5. The room fell quiet in a way that felt different from the respectful silence that had preceded the other performances. Maria could sense that people were holding their breath, waiting to see how this was going to play out. Some of her classmates had worried openly about her ability to handle such a difficult piece, and everyone was curious to see what would happen. Maria stood up on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. The walk from her chair to the piano bench felt like it took forever, and she was painfully aware of every eye in the room following her movement. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, so loud that she wondered if other people could hear it too. She sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it to the right height, a gesture so automatic that she didn't realize she had done it until it was too late. The adjustment was perfect, exactly what a professional pianist would do, not what a struggling beginner would think to do. She glanced up quickly to see if anyone had noticed, but most people were just waiting patiently for her to begin. Maria placed her hands above the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself the way she used to before important performances. But instead of finding calm, she found herself transported back to that terrible night at Carnegie Hall. The bright lights, the expectant silence, the moment when everything fell apart. Her hands started to shake again, and she opened her eyes to find Professor Rodriguez watching her intently from across the room. For the first time since she had known him, his expression was completely unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was expecting her to fail spectacularly or perform brilliantly, and that uncertainty made everything worse. The silence in the room stretched on longer than it should have. People began to shift in their seats, and she could hear someone whisper, "Is she okay?" Lisa looked genuinely concerned, and Jake was leaning forward in his chair as if he was ready to help if she needed it. Maria realized that she had reached the point of no return. She could either play this piece and face whatever consequences came with revealing her true abilities, or she could stand up and admit that she couldn't do it, which would be a different kind of revelation altogether. She took a deep breath, positioned her fingers on the keys, and made a choice that would change everything. The first notes of Chopin's Etude rang out into the silent room, clear and precise and undeniably professional. There was no going back now. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Every note was exactly where it should be, every phrase shaped with the kind of understanding that only comes from years of intensive study. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision, navigating the complex passages as if they were as natural as breathing. As she played, Maria could feel the atmosphere in the room changing. The polite attention that had characterized the other performances was replaced by something much more intense. People stopped shifting in their seats and leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected beauty and sophistication of what they were hearing. But Maria was no longer thinking about the audience or their reactions. For the first time in 15 years, she was completely lost in the music, remembering why she had fallen in love with piano in the first place, and forgetting, at least for these few precious minutes, why she had ever stopped. The music filled every corner of the classroom with a power and beauty that nobody had expected. Maria's fingers danced across the keys with breathtaking precision, turning the challenging Chopin etude into something that sounded effortless and magical. Every note was crystal clear, every phrase perfectly shaped with the kind of musical understanding that takes decades to develop. The transformation was so complete and so shocking that for the first few seconds, nobody in the room could quite process what they were hearing. This was the same woman who had struggled with basic scales just weeks ago, the same person who seemed to barely remember where middle C was located. Yet here she was, performing one of classical music's most demanding pieces with the skill of a concert pianist. Jake's mouth fell open so wide that his girlfriend had to gently push his chin up. Lisa gripped her husband's hand so tightly that he winced, but he was too mesmerized by the performance to complain. Tom, the construction worker who had been taking piano lessons to bond with his daughter, sat completely still with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty of what he was witnessing. But it was Professor Rodriguez whose reaction was the most intense. He stood frozen near the back of the room, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand, watching Maria with a mixture of amazement and dawning understanding. Everything suddenly made sense. The way she sometimes corrected her posture automatically, the moments when she seemed to know more than she was letting on, the careful mistakes that had never quite felt genuine. As Maria continued to play, the music seemed to unlock something inside her that had been locked away for 15 years. The fear and anxiety that had been consuming her for weeks began to melt away, replaced by the pure joy of making music. This was who she really was. Not the timid accountant who sat in the back of the classroom, but someone who could create beauty with her hands and share it with the world. The technical passages that should have been impossible for someone at her supposed skill level flowed by like gentle streams. Her fingers found every note without hesitation. Her pedaling was perfectly timed, and her musical interpretation showed a maturity that spoke of years of serious study. She wasn't just playing the notes correctly, she was making the music come alive. But even as she lost herself in the performance, part of Maria's mind was acutely aware of what was happening in the room around her. She could feel the shocked silence, could sense the way people were leaning forward in their chairs, could almost hear the mental gears turning as her classmates tried to reconcile what they were hearing with what they thought they knew about her. The piece reached its climactic section, where rapid arpeggios cascade up and down the keyboard like musical waterfalls. This was the part that even advanced students often struggled with, requiring not just technical skill but the kind of stamina and control that comes from years of practice. Maria played it flawlessly, her hands moving so quickly they seemed to blur, yet every single note rang out clearly and beautifully. As the etude neared its conclusion, Maria found herself thinking about all the times she had performed this piece before. Concert halls in Vienna and Prague, competitions where she had won first prize, private recitals for music lovers who appreciated classical piano. She remembered the feeling of being completely at home on stage, confident in her abilities and proud of what she could accomplish. But she also remembered why she had given it all up. The pressure, the expectations, the night when everything had fallen apart in front of thousands of people. The music had been her greatest love and her greatest source of pain, and she had spent 15 years trying to live without both. The final notes of the etude rang out in the quiet classroom, hanging in the air like beautiful ghosts before gradually fading to silence. Maria's hands remained on the keys for a moment as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Then she slowly lifted them and turned to face the audience. The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite quiet that had followed the other performances. or even the appreciative hush that comes after a good concert. This was the silence of complete shock, of people trying to process something that had fundamentally changed their understanding of reality. For what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Maria could see the confusion and amazement on every face in the room. These people had come to support a struggling beginner, and instead they had witnessed a performance that belonged on a professional stage. Finally, it was Jake who broke their silence. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Maria, who are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, people who had been kind to her, who had offered her help and encouragement, who had genuinely cared about her progress, people she had been lying to for months. Professor Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and something that might have been anger. "I think," he said slowly, "that we deserve an explanation." Maria felt tears starting to build behind her eyes, but for the first time in weeks they weren't tears of fear or anxiety. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of 15 years' worth of emotion finally finding a way out. She stood up from the piano bench and faced the room full of people who were waiting for answers. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and clear. "My name is Maria Santos," she began, using her full name for the first time in the class. "And I haven't been completely honest with you about who I am." The admission seemed to open a floodgate inside her. The words that had been trapped for so long began to pour out. "I started playing piano when I was 5 years old. By the time I was 12, I was performing with youth orchestras. At 16, I was touring Europe, playing in some of the most prestigious concert halls in the world. I won competitions, got reviews in major newspapers, and had a promising career ahead of me." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing with the hardest part of her story. "When I was 19, I was performing at Carnegie Hall, one of the most important venues in classical music. It was supposed to be my breakthrough performance, the concert that would launch my career to the next level. But in the middle of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, my mind went completely blank. I sat there in front of 2,000 people, unable to remember a single note. I had to walk off stage. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on her every word. That night destroyed me," Maria continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I was so humiliated, so terrified that it would happen again that I stopped performing entirely. I changed my name, moved across the country, and built a completely different life. For 15 years, I barely touched a piano." Lisa was crying, now her hand over her mouth in shock and sympathy. David had his arm around her shoulders, but his eyes never left Maria's face. "I came to this class because I missed music, but I was too afraid to admit who I really was. I thought if I could just be a beginner again, maybe I could find some small way back to the thing I loved without risking the kind of pain I experienced before." Professor Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Maria, do you have any idea how extraordinary what you just did was? That performance, that was professional level. That was Carnegie Hall level." Maria laughed through her tears. "I know, and that terrifies me more than you can imagine." The room erupted in conversation as people began to process what they had just learned. Some were asking questions, others were expressing amazement at her skill, and a few were discussing what this meant for her future. But it was Tom, the construction worker, who asked the question that mattered most. "So what happens now, Maria? Are you going to go back to performing?" Maria looked around the room at all these people who had accepted her as a struggling beginner and were now grappling with the reality of who she actually was. She thought about the performance she had just given, about how natural it had felt to let her true abilities show, about the 15 years she had spent hiding from the thing that had once defined her entire identity. "I don't know," she said honestly. "For the first time in 15 years, I really don't know, but I think I'm finally ready to find out." Professor Rodriguez approached her with something that looked like a mixture of respect and apology. "Maria, I owe you an apology. I thought I was pushing a lazy student, but I was actually forcing someone to confront their deepest fears. I'm not sure if I should be proud of the result or ashamed of my methods. Maria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Maybe both. But thank you. I needed to be pushed, even if I didn't know it at the time. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Maria found herself surrounded by her classmates. They had questions, of course, but more than that, they had acceptance. Jake asked if she would help him with some advanced techniques. Lisa wanted to know if she would consider giving private lessons. Tom simply hugged her and told her how grateful he was to have witnessed something so beautiful. Walking to her car that night, Maria felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes. The parking lot looked the same. The streetlights cast the same shadows, but everything felt different. For 15 years, she had been living as half of herself.